The doctor said the number once, and my grandson stopped breathing for half a second like his body had misheard on purpose. Not out loud, not dramatically, just a pause, barely noticeable, except I was watching him too closely to miss it. Ethan's eyes didn't widen. His mouth didn't open. His chest simply froze, like something inside him had been unplugged, and when he inhaled again, it sounded practiced, controlled, already rationed. The doctor kept talking, voice steady, careful, trained not to flinch when he ruins someone's future before lunch. I heard words like advanced and comfort, but the only thing that stayed lodged in my chest was the time frame. Less than 2 months, not a season, not a year, a countdown. I didn't look at Ethan first. I looked at his wife. Lila was sitting 2 chairs away, legs crossed, hands folded neatly over her stomach, eyes fixed on the doctor like she was listening for instructions. Not grief, not fear, instructions. She nodded once, slow, as if filing something away. When the doctor finally stopped speaking and the room fell into that dangerous silence where people reveal themselves, she exhaled and said, "Okay." Just that. Okay. Like the weather had changed. Ethan slid off the table carefully, movements precise, conserving energy he hadn't known he'd need so soon. I stood too fast, my knees weak, my palms damp, but I kept my face still because panic helps no one. The hallway outside the room felt longer than before, lights buzzing overhead, nurses passing us like nothing had happened. Ethan stopped walking halfway down and turned to me. His eyes were sharp, too sharp for a man who had just been told he was dying. "Don't call anyone yet," he said quietly. Behind us, Lila was already on her phone. "Your mother should know," she said without looking up. "People will expect updates. We should get ahead of this." Get ahead? The words scraped. Ethan didn't argue. He just, repeated himself, firmer this time. "Not yet." Lila smiled then, tight, polite, brittle. "We're running out of time," she replied. The way she said we made my stomach knot. I stepped closer to Ethan and lowered my voice. "You decide," I told him. "I follow." My name is Inez Morris, and I raised Ethan after his mother, Carla, left when he was still learning which adults stayed and which ones didn't. If you're watching this right now, tell me the time where you are, because moments like this don't wait for permission, and I want to know where this story found you. The phone rang before we reached the parking garage. Carla's name lit up my screen like a ghost that suddenly remembered how to dial. I didn't answer. Ethan saw it anyway. He didn't look surprised. He nodded once like this was confirmation of something he'd already known. The drive home was quiet in a way that made my skin crawl. Lila typed steadily, thumbs moving with intention. Ethan stared straight ahead, jaw set, eyes glassy but focused, like he was memorizing the road. Carla showed up before the engine even cooled. Loud voice, strong perfume, arms wide like she'd never missed a birthday or a school play. "My baby!" she cried, collapsing into him with grief that arrived suspiciously on time. Ethan accepted the hug the way you accept rain when there's nowhere else to stand, without resistance, without warmth. Lila watched the entire exchange without stepping in, eyes flicking between them like she was measuring leverage. That night, after the house filled with noise that sounded like concern but felt like pressure, Ethan asked me to come into his study. He closed the door himself. His hands shook when he sat down, not from fear but from effort. He took my hand and held it like it was the last solid thing in the room. His voice dropped. Not weak, not emotional, deliberate. "Grandma," he whispered, "never tell anyone I own the house and the $320. Million..." The number didn't sound real coming out of Ethan's mouth. It sounded like a mistake a man makes when he's confused, except Ethan wasn't confused. He was calm, clear, and deadly serious, and my whole body went cold the way it does when the truth is too big to carry in your hands. 320 million, he repeated, not proud, not excited, just tired, like the money had been a weight he'd been dragging for years in silence. My throat tightened so fast I could barely swallow. I stared at him in that small study where he used to sit and fix broken toys when he was a boy, and for a second I saw two Ethans layered over each other, the child I tucked in at night, and this grown man staring at his own ending while handing me a secret like a live wire. "Ethan," was all I could say, because my mind wanted to argue with my ears. He squeezed my hand once, steadying me like he'd already decided I was the only person who could hold this without dropping it. "I won it years ago," he said softly. "Late 20s. It was one ticket. I claimed it quietly. I didn't tell anyone because I didn't want a parade of hands on my life." He didn't talk like a man boasting about luck. He talked like a man explaining why he'd locked the doors. He told me he'd set things up so his name wouldn't be the headline, so nobody could find him through a quick search, so the money wouldn't turn every cousin and old classmate into a friend. He said he kept working because he liked the work, because he needed days that felt normal because he refused to be reduced to a number. He bought the house outright, modest, neat, quiet, because he wanted something solid that didn't talk back. He lived simple on purpose, drove a sensible car, wore the same watch year after year, and if he gave quietly, because he couldn't stand the idea of people clapping for a good deed the way they clap for a performance. As he spoke, I felt something inside me rearrange. All those moments over the years when people had looked at him a little too long, listened a little too hard, made jokes about him, having it good, the way certain relatives called only when rent was due or a bill was late. I had always thought it was regular greed, regular laziness. But now I understood. Ethan had been moving through the world like a man carrying water in a cracked cup, always careful, always watching, always choosing who got close enough to spill him. "That's why I didn't marry money," he said, and the way he said it wasn't bitter, just honest. "I married who I thought she was." He didn't say Lika's name, but we both heard it in the air. I tried to breathe quietly so my fear wouldn't turn into noise. "Does she know?" I asked. Ethan's eyes flicked toward the door, and his voice dropped lower. "No, and she can't. Not now." He paused, then added, "She's been asking questions, not directly. Little sideways ones. What I signed at the hospital, where certain papers are, who the house would go to if something happened." My stomach sank, not because I was shocked she'd be thinking ahead, but because of the cold precision in how she was thinking ahead. Before I could answer, there was a soft knock. Then the handle shifted like someone testing whether we were locked away from them. Ethan didn't jump. He just looked at the door with a tired patience, like he'd already counted how many times he'd have to defend his boundary before the end. "Ethan," Lika's voice slipped through, sweet on the surface. "I brought you tea, and we need to talk about something." Ethan didn't respond right away. He held my gaze, and I saw it. The flicker of disappointment, the grief of realizing that illness reveals people faster than time ever did. "Not now," he called, calm. "Later." The silence after was thin. Then Lika tried again, still gentle but sharper underneath. "Ethan, this is serious. We should have the paperwork in one place. Your mom is here and she's asking what she needs to do. I'm your wife. We can't keep acting like this isn't happening." The way she said your mom made my skin prickle because Carla had no business sounding like a responsible partner in anything. Ethan's jaw tightened. "My mother," he said, and his voice changed, less gentle now, more final. "Abandoned me. She doesn't get to come back and pretend she's been here the whole time." On the other side of the door, I heard Lika exhale like she was trying to keep her temper dressed up as concern. "People are going to ask questions," she said. "I'm pregnant. I need to know where we stand." Ethan's eyes narrowed, not at the pregnancy itself, but at the way she used it like a key. He leaned closer to me, keeping his voice low enough that it stayed ours. "You raised me when she didn't," he said. "You loved me when she chose herself." I'm not leaving anything to people who only show up to collect. His words didn't sound like revenge. They sounded like a man finally naming the truth out loud. My chest ached, but it wasn't floating pain. It was the pain of understanding what I was about to carry after he was gone. I swallowed, slow, because I could feel my heart trying to outrun my face. Ethan's hand tightened around mine again, and his eyes held mine with a quiet urgency that turned my fear into focus. "Promise me," he said, voice steady as a vow, "you'll update everything before I'm gone." By the end of that week, Ethan couldn't stand for long without his breath turning shallow, but he still sat upright at the dining table, like he was clocking into a job only he could do. Shoulders squared, a blanket folded over his knees, a glass of water placed just out of reach so he'd have to stay deliberate. The pain was written in the small pauses between his movements. The way he closed his eyes for one extra second before lifting a pen, the way his fingers flexed like they were trying to remember how to hold weight, but his voice stayed steady, calm in a way that scared me more than crying would have. "I'm scheduling a meeting," he told me, phone in his hand, thumb hovering over a contact he didn't name out loud. "Not with anybody we know, somebody neutral." He said neutral like a shield. Carla was in the kitchen, making noise with dishes she didn't need to touch, performing usefulness with her back turned, so we couldn't see her face. Lika was on the couch, scrolling with her legs tucked under her, belly cradled as if it belonged to the room more than the man fighting for air 3 feet away. When Ethan mentioned a meeting, her head lifted fast. "A meeting with who?" she asked, tone careful, sweetened at the edges. Ethan didn't look at her right away. He looked at me. "I want this clean," he said. "No family, voices, no pressure, just facts." The way he said family voices told me he already knew what his mother and wife sounded like when money was near. The day of the meeting, the living room felt too bright, too ordinary for what was happening inside it. Ethan wore a clean shirt like he was trying to respect himself, but his skin had that faint yellow cast that made my stomach twist every time I noticed it. Carla kept hovering by the front window, peeking through the blinds like she expected someone important to arrive for her. Lika rearranged throw pillows twice, hands moving with restless energy she couldn't hide. When the knock came, Ethan flinched, not from fear but from exhaustion, and I went to the door first. The woman who stepped in didn't announce herself with smiles or sympathy. She was calm, direct, dressed simple, holding a slim folder and a small bag like she'd done this before and didn't need to dress it up. Ethan greeted her from the table without standing. "Thank you for coming," he said. "I want to do this the right way." Lika rose immediately. "I should be in this," she said like it was obvious. "I'm his wife." The woman glanced at Ethan, not at Lika, and waited. Ethan's voice stayed quiet. "Not today," he said. "This is between me and my grandmother." Lika's smile tightened so quickly, I saw her bite down on it. "Ethan," she began, but he cut her off with a look that didn't raise its volume, only its authority. I said no. The room went still in a way that made even Carla stop pretending with the blinds. Lika's eyes flicked to Carla, searching for reinforcement, and Carla gave her a small nod. Nothing loud, just a signal. Ethan saw it. He didn't comment. He didn't have to. The woman at the table opened her folder and spoke in a tone that wasn't cold, just professional, asking Ethan a few simple questions. His name, the date, where he was, what he wanted. The questions weren't an interrogation. They were a quiet test of clarity, and Ethan answered without hesitation, voice steady, eyes focused. I watched him, and something inside me hardened into respect and grief at the same time. He wasn't preparing to die. He was preparing to make sure his death didn't become a feast. At one point, he paused and slid a small envelope across the table toward the woman. "I want instructions sealed," he said. "Not for everyone, for one specific situation." The woman didn't react like it was dramatic. She just nodded once, as if she'd seen how people try to weaponize grief before. "What situation?" she asked. Ethan's gaze flicked toward the hallway where Lika's footsteps had stopped, like she was listening without wanting to be seen. He lowered his voice. "If my wife claims a child to take control of what I've protected," he said. The words landed heavy, not because they were loud, but because they were precise. My chest tightened. Lika hadn't. Even stepped fully into the room, and already he was building walls against the shape of her argument. The woman wrote something down, then looked at Ethan. "Understood," she said. "We'll handle it the way you've requested." Carla's voice floated in from the kitchen, sharp and syrupy at once. "What are y'all doing in here?" she called, like she had a right to know. Ethan didn't answer her. He didn't have energy for performances. He only glanced at me, and in that glance I felt him asking me to be steel when he could no longer hold it himself. I nodded slightly, committing without words. Lika appeared at the mouth of the hallway, not fully entering, just standing where she could be seen and heard, arms folded loosely, chin lifted. "Ethan, you're shutting me out," she said softly, as if she were the injured one. Ethan didn't argue. He picked up the pen, his hand trembling once, before he steadied it against the table. The woman turned the paper toward him. "This is the document we discussed," she said. Ethan signed slowly, each stroke careful, like he was carving a boundary into the world. I watched his name form on the page, and I saw Lika's eyes fixed on that pen as if the ink itself was currency. Ethan lifted his head, still holding the pen, and his voice stayed quiet but final. "This is how it's going to be," he said. Lika didn't respond, but her jaw tightened, and I knew she had just watched the door to her future close, without ever understanding what was behind it. I knew something had shifted the first time I heard Lika crying on the phone, with her voice pitched just high enough for the person on the other end to feel important for listening. Ethan was still alive, still breathing, still walking slowly from room to room, still trying to hold on to dignity. But Lika was already speaking like a widow in waiting, wrapping herself in sympathy the way some people wrap themselves in expensive coats. I stood in the hallway outside his bedroom and listened without meaning to, because she wasn't whispering. She wanted the house to hear it. "He's so weak," she said softly, dragging the words out. "And the baby feels everything." Her hand slid over her belly in a slow circle, a movement she'd started doing more often, like a habit she wanted everyone to memorize. When she ended the call, she didn't wipe her tears. She came out of the bedroom with dry cheeks and a settled expression, phone already in her hand again, and I felt that strange disconnect that makes your skin prickle, the difference between grief and performance. "I'm going to start updating people," she announced, standing near the kitchen doorway like she owned the air. "No rumors, no confusion. We need to control the message." Control. She said it like love required management. Ethan was on the couch, eyes half closed, his face turned toward the window as if the light might help him breathe. He didn't respond immediately, and Lika took his silence as permission. She began calling folks from his phone, not to let them speak to him, but to deliver a version of him, weak, fading, dependent, packaged neatly under her voice. "He's resting," she'd say. "He can't talk, but he knows you care." Sometimes she'd add, "The doctors said we have to stay calm for the baby," like the baby was a lock on the door, like nobody could question her without looking cruel. Visitors started appearing at the edge of the day, co-workers wanting to drop off food, one friend from childhood asking to sit with him, and Lika turned them away with a bright smile and a hand on her belly. "He needs quiet," she'd tell them. "Stress could hurt the pregnancy." The thing was, Ethan did need quiet. He truly did. That's what made her manipulation so slick. She used the truth like a weapon and wrapped it in softness so nobody would notice the edge. I watched her schedules too, because I couldn't help it. She would announce appointments like they were facts that couldn't be challenged. "I have my prenatal check tomorrow," she'd say, "then I'm meeting the hospice nurse." But the details didn't hold still. One day she said the appointment was early morning, then later she said it was after lunch. One day she said she was 8 weeks. Another day she said almost 3 months. And when Carla asked in a sugary voice, "How far along you say you are, baby?" Lika blinked once, then answered like she was reading off a card. "Right where I need to be," she said, smiling too hard. Carla smiled back, and I saw it, the way two women can recognize each other's hunger without ever naming it. Carla had been showing up more often, dressed too well for a sick house, speaking too loudly, calling Ethan my son like I hadn't raised him. She'd bring small things, fruit, magazines he didn't read, a blanket she claimed was his favorite as a child, and she'd place them in the room like markers, like proof of ownership. Lika would hover near her, offering tea, laughing at Carla's stories, letting Carla talk about when Ethan was little, as if Carla had been there. They weren't bonding out of love. They were rehearsing a partnership. I noticed it in the way they leaned their heads together in the kitchen, voices dropping when I walked in, then lifting back up too quick. "We're just trying to stay organized," Lika would say, cheerful. "This is a lot." One afternoon, I came around the corner and caught them mid-whisper without warning. Carla's hand was on Lika's forearm, light, intimate, guiding. Lika's phone was open, screen bright, and when Carla spoke, her voice slid through the air like something slick. "Don't worry," she murmured. "We'll handle it after." After. The word didn't need explanation. After meant after he stopped breathing. After meant after grief, turned into paperwork. After meant after they wouldn't have to pretend anymore. My heart didn't race. It sank. There's a difference. Racing is panic. Sinking is clarity. I didn't step into the kitchen. I didn't accuse them. I didn't give them the satisfaction of seeing me react. I backed away quietly and went into my room, closing the door with care, like my peace still mattered. Then I did something I hadn't done in years. I pulled out a notebook and wrote down what I'd heard, the exact words, the date, the time, the way Carla's hand had gripped Lika's arm like a signal. I wrote down Lika's shifting timelines too, not as proof, not yet, but as a map. Because once you realize people are counting your grief as their opportunity, you stop talking and start recording. That evening, Carla arrived again, this time carrying a gift bag with tissue paper puffed up like a celebration. She smiled too wide, eyes shining like she was about to offer comfort, and she held the bag out toward me instead of Ethan. "Inez," she said softly, sweet as syrup, "I brought something for the baby." Then she tilted her head and asked the question that didn't belong in a sick house, the question only greed asks when it's trying to sound like family. "So, have you seen where Ethan keeps his important papers?" The night his breathing changed, the whole house changed with it, like every wall leaned in to listen. Ethan was sitting upright in bed, pillows stacked behind him, eyes open but unfocused, and each inhale came with a thin, stubborn sound that didn't belong to a man who used to run miles for fun. The lamp on the nightstand threw a soft circle of light across his face, and I watched his chest rise and fall like it was doing work it never had to do before. Lika kept hovering at the doorway, not close enough to help, close enough to witness, hands moving between her belly and her phone, restless like she was trying to decide which one needed attention more. When the hospice nurse finally arrived, the air turned quiet in a different way, less fear, more final. She spoke gently, explained what comfort would look like now, how the goal wasn't to fight the clock, but to keep Ethan from suffering. And while she talked, I watched Ethan's eyes track her words with that same calm focus he'd had since the day of the diagnosis, like he was studying the shape of his own ending. After she left, Ethan asked me to sit beside him, close enough that he could feel me without having to reach. "It's time," he whispered, and my throat tightened because the sentence wasn't about hospice. It was about everything. The next morning, he insisted on one more meeting at the dining table, and I hated how small he looked walking there, wrapped in a sweater that hung looser than it should, moving like each step cost him a private argument. The woman from before arrived again, same calm, same folder, and this time she brought a second person, an older man with kind eyes who didn't carry himself like family or friend, just someone trained to observe. Ethan didn't flinch when he saw him. He only nodded once, like he understood what that man's presence meant. They didn't turn the room into a courtroom. They kept it simple. The older man asked Ethan a few straightforward questions, the kind you can answer without effort if your mind is clear, and Ethan answered with steady clarity, voice thin but sharp. Lika lingered near the hallway again, pretending to straighten something on the wall, but I could feel her listening the way you feel a draft under a door. When the questions ended, the woman slid a few papers across the table, and Ethan's hand shook once as he reached for the pen, not from confusion, just weakness. I watched the pen meet paper and felt the strange ache of seeing a young man do end-of-life things with the composure of an old one. Carla tried to interrupt twice from the kitchen, saying she wanted to understand what's going on, but Ethan didn't give her a glance. He signed what he needed to sign, slow and careful, and the woman gathered the papers without triumph, only respect. When she and the older man finally left, the house didn't return to normal. It just returned to quiet. That afternoon, Lika approached Ethan with a softness that felt rehearsed. She brought him water, adjusted the blanket, sat on the edge of the couch like a woman trying to look devoted for an invisible camera. "We should talk," she said, voice low and controlled, "about security." Ethan's eyes stayed on the muted television, but I could tell he was listening. Lika leaned closer, one palm pressed to her belly, and she said, "If something happens, I need to know I'm protected. This baby needs stability. Your mother is scared, Ethan. Everybody's scared. We can't be locked out of decisions." Her words sounded caring until you listened closely, and then you could hear the teeth behind them. Ethan closed his eyes for a moment, the kind of pause a man takes when he's deciding whether to spend his last energy on truth or on comfort. When he opened them again, he didn't look at her. He looked at me. It was subtle, but it was a choice. Lika noticed it, and I saw the flicker of irritation she swallowed down. "Ethan," she pressed, still gentle, "you're shutting me out." Ethan finally turned his head toward her, and there was no anger in his face, only disappointment so clean it made my stomach drop. "Stop," he said quietly. "Not stop talking. Stop trying." Lika's mouth tightened, and she stood up a little too quickly, her chair legs scraping the floor like a warning. "I'm your wife," she said, softer now, but colder. "I'm not your enemy." Ethan watched her for a long second, then looked away again like the truth was too heavy to hold in front of her. Later, when Carla and Lika were both distracted, Carla on the phone in the kitchen, Lika outside pacing with her phone tilted away from the windows, Ethan asked me to come into his bedroom and close the door. He was lying back against the pillows, eyes tired, lips dry, voice barely above breath. I sat close and took his hand, and he held on like he needed the contact to stay anchored. He didn't waste time. He didn't dress it up. "She's not who I thought," he said, and the words landed like a quiet break. My eyes burned, but I didn't cry yet. Crying would make noise, and Ethan needed quiet. I nodded once, and he squeezed my hand. "You can't explain this to them," he whispered. "Don't argue. Don't defend. Just disappear when you need to." My chest tightened because he wasn't giving me permission to run from grief. He was giving me permission to protect myself from people who would use grief to corner me. Then he reached under the pillow with a slow, careful movement and pulled out a small sealed envelope. He pressed it into my palm like he was transferring something sacred and dangerous at the same time. His eyes held mine, steady and urgent, and his voice came out thin but unmistakable. "Only open it if she uses a baby to come for it." Ethan went quiet the way a candle goes out when the room is still. No struggle, no dramatic moment, just one last breath. That didn't come back, and a silence so complete I felt it settle into the house like dust. I sat there beside him, with my hand on his forearm, waiting for the world to argue with what had just happened, waiting for something to reverse itself. But nothing did. His face looked younger once the pain left it, and that was the cruelest part, seeing peace arrive only when life was gone. I didn't scream. I didn't wail. I didn't collapse. My grief stayed inside my chest, heavy and hot, because if I let it out too fast, I knew it would drown me right there in that room. Lika stood near the doorway, one hand over her belly, the other holding her phone. When she finally stepped forward, she touched Ethan's shoulder with 2 fingers like she was afraid grief might stain her. Then she turned away and started typing. Carla arrived later, breathless and loud, throwing her arms around the hallway like the house owed her a scene. "My baby!" she cried, voice cracking on purpose. I watched her press her cheek against the door frame like she was performing for somebody I couldn't see. I didn't correct her. Ethan was gone. Correcting her wouldn't bring him back. The funeral came quick because that's what people do when they don't know what else to do with pain. They schedule it, package it, try to make it manageable. Ethan would have hated anything big, and I honored that. The room was small, the flowers modest, the music soft enough to feel like breath. The people who came were the ones who had actually loved him. A handful of co-workers who looked lost without their steady, quiet friend, 2 old friends who kept their eyes on the floor like they were afraid the wrong glance would break them, and a neighbor who had once shoveled Ethan's walkway without being asked. They didn't wear grief like jewelry. They wore it like weight. I stood near the front, hands clasped, spine straight, because Ethan had asked me, without words, with that look he gave me in the end, to be the last piece of order in a moment where everything felt torn open. When the doors opened again and Carla swept in, I felt the temperature shift. She didn't come in with tenderness. She came in with presence. Perfume first, then heels, then a voice that wanted to be heard. Lika followed behind her, late too, face dry, eyes sharp, belly cradled like a badge. They moved through the room slowly, not toward the front, not toward Ethan's picture, but along the edges, scanning faces the way people do when they're looking for names and connections. Carla's eyes flicked over the mourners like she was counting who mattered. Lika's gaze landed on the guest book, then on the floral arrangements, then on the man who'd spoken quietly about Ethan's kindness. It wasn't grief that moved them. It was assessment. Carla hugged people she didn't know, holding them too long, crying too loud. "He was my son," she kept saying, as if repeating it could rewrite history. "He was everything to me." The words sat wrong in my stomach, but I swallowed them down because funerals aren't for arguments. Lika stood beside her, nodding at the right moments, letting Carla take center stage, letting the room believe a mother's tears, without examining whether those tears had been absent for years. At one point, a coworker approached me, eyes wet, voice trembling. "He talked about you," she whispered. "He said you kept him safe." I nodded because my mouth didn't trust itself. Over her shoulder, I saw Carla watching us, her expression shifting when she realized Ethan had told people about me, not about her. That was the first time I saw something real flicker across Carla's face. Jealousy, sharp and quick. Lika leaned in and murmured something to her, and Carla's mouth tightened, then smoothed back into a smile. I caught only a few words as they passed behind me, but it was enough to make my skin prickle. "Just watch," Lika whispered. "We'll figure it out." Carla nodded, eyes sweeping the room again. That's when it hit me with a clarity that made my grief feel almost secondary. They weren't here to mourn Ethan. They were here to measure what he left behind, who he trusted, who might know something, who might stand in their way. I didn't confront them. I didn't pull Carla aside. I didn't ask Lika why her eyes looked more calculating than broken. Ethan had warned me not to argue, not to defend, and I understood now why. Confrontation would only give them a stage. Silence would deny them one. When the service ended, people drifted out slowly, leaving behind soft condolences and half-finished sentences. Carla lingered by the door like she expected someone to stop her and crown her the rightful grief. Lika kept checking her phone. I waited until the room thinned, until I could breathe again without hearing my own heart. Then I stepped outside into the cold air and let it hit my face like reality. My phone buzzed once in my pocket. I didn't look right away. I stood still, watching Carla and Lika walk toward their car side by side, close enough to look united, not close enough to look loving. When they drove off, I finally pulled my phone out. There was a voicemail waiting from a number I didn't recognize, and the preview line made my stomach drop before I even pressed play. "Hello, this is the attorney's office. Calling regarding Ethan Morris." The knock came hard and clean, not the gentle kind you give when you're visiting the grieving, but the kind you give when you believe the door belongs to you. I was standing at the sink, rinsing a cup Ethan had used for his water, still moving through the house like my hands could keep him here if they stayed busy. The sound snapped through the quiet, and before I even reached the door, I felt it. An old instinct rising in my chest, the one that warns you when somebody is about to bring trouble into a space that's already bruised. When I opened it, Carla was standing on the porch dressed like she was going to a meeting, not like she'd buried her son 3 days ago. Lika stood beside her, chin lifted, one hand resting on her belly like a signal flag, and between them was a man in a tailored suit, holding a thin folder under his arm with the kind of ease that comes from being paid to speak for other people's greed. He smiled first, not warmth, practice. "Mrs. Morris," he said, voice smooth, eyes scanning past me into the house. "We're here regarding Ethan Morris's estate." Carla didn't greet me. She stepped forward like she was walking into her own living room. "We need to talk," she said, and there was no grief in it, just authority she hadn't earned. Lika's eyes flicked over my face, then past my shoulder, checking the hallway, the walls, the corners. I could see her calculating what was inside, what might be hidden, what might be moved before she could touch it. I didn't invite them in. I didn't have to. The man in the suit didn't wait for permission either. He held up the folder slightly, like a badge. "We'd prefer to do this calmly," he said, "but we are prepared to proceed formally if necessary." The word formally made Carla's mouth tighten into something like satisfaction. Lika stayed quiet, rubbing her belly in slow circles, eyes softened to look like she was fragile, like she might break if anyone spoke harshly to her. It was a performance built to make me look cruel if I didn't comply. I stepped onto the porch and closed the door behind me, not slamming it, just shutting it with care. This was my house now in every way that mattered, and I wasn't going to let them fill it with their voices. "Say what you came to say," I told them, calm. Carla's eyebrows lifted like she didn't recognize restraint as strength. "Ethan had no right," she began, voice sharpening, "to leave everything to you." The man in the suit slid a paper out of the folder without looking down, like he'd rehearsed this in the mirror. "We are contesting the will," he said, and his tone was polite enough to sound reasonable, but the threat underneath was clear. "We're requesting full disclosure of assets, access to property documents, and immediate turnover of any keys, account information, and records in your possession." Keys, records, turnover. Those words didn't belong in a mourning week. They belonged in a takeover. I looked at Carla, and for a flash I saw the little girl she used to be before she learned to make hunger look like confidence. But that flash didn't last. She leaned toward me, lowering her voice as if she were doing me a favor. "Inez, don't make this harder," she said. "I'm his mother. Blood counts. A grandmother doesn't outrank me." Lika's lips pressed together like she wanted to add something, but was waiting for the right moment. The lawyer stepped in again, smiling. "There are concerns," he said, "about undue influence." The phrase hung in the air, sharp and ugly. Ethan was terminally ill, vulnerable, dependent. It raises questions when significant decisions are made near the end of life, and a non-spouse beneficiary receives primary benefit. Carla nodded eagerly, like she'd been waiting to hear her own accusations spoken in professional language. "You manipulated him," she said, voice rising. "You got in his head. You always thought you owned him because you raised him." Lika finally spoke then, and her voice came out soft, controlled, threaded with just enough sadness to make strangers believe her. "He promised me security," she said, one hand still on her belly. "He told me we were building a future. I'm carrying his child, Mrs. Morris. This can't be right." I watched her eyes as she spoke, and they weren't pleading. They were testing. The lawyer opened the folder wider and pulled out more papers, fanning them slightly so I could see the headings without reading details. "If we do not receive cooperation," he said, "we will file formal action alleging undue influence, fraud, and concealment of assets. We will also seek court orders for disclosure." Fraud, concealment. The words were meant to rattle me, to make me react, to make me admit something through panic. I didn't. My hands stayed still at my sides. My face stayed calm. The only thing I felt was a cold clarity settling over my grief like armor. Ethan had warned me not to argue, and now I understood why. Argument gives them emotion to pull on. Silence gives them nothing. "There is nothing to turn over," I said quietly. Carla scoffed, too fast. "Oh, please," she snapped. "You expect us to believe Ethan had nothing? He owned this house, didn't he? Where did he get the money for it? He was a tech worker, not a millionaire." The way she said millionaire made my stomach drop because it was the first time she'd admitted what she suspected. Not the number, not the truth, the hunger. Lika stepped closer, belly first, and her voice softened even more. "We can do this the easy way," she murmured, "for the baby." The lawyer slid the papers forward toward me, holding them out as if the folder itself had authority. "Sign here acknowledging receipt," he said, "and provide the keys and documentation requested." I didn't reach for the papers. I didn't flinch. I didn't explain. I looked at each of them slowly. Carla, who hadn't loved Ethan until love turned into property, and Lika, who wore pregnancy like a shield, and I kept my voice level. "You can file whatever you want," I said, "but you will not bully me into giving you something you haven't earned." Carla's face tightened, and the lawyer's smile thinned. Then Lika lifted her chin, rubbed her belly once more like a final card, and said the sentence she'd been saving like a weapon. "My child is his heir." The first letter my lawyer sent back was only one sentence long, and when I read it, something in my chest loosened. Not relief, not comfort, just the steadying feeling of standing on solid ground. Provide your basis. That was it. No arguing, no pleading, no explaining Ethan's heart to people who had never bothered to learn it while it was beating. Just a clean demand for truth. I slid the letter back into the envelope and set it on the table like it was ordinary mail, but my hand stayed still for a long time afterward, because this was the moment grief officially became a process. Outside, the neighborhood kept living. A dog barked somewhere down the street. A lawnmower started up and then stopped. And inside my house, Carla and Lika were learning the first lesson Ethan had built into this whole thing. Panic is a gift you don't have to give. Days moved in sharp, unnatural beats. Phone calls I didn't answer. Messages that arrived like threats dressed in politeness. A second packet of papers left on my porch as if they could plant authority in my yard. My lawyer handled the talking. I handled the waiting. When the formal requests began, they didn't come with drama. They came with lists, copies, dates, provide records of signatures, provide timeline of document execution, provide evidence of capacity. Words like capacity and timing floated through my life now like weather I couldn't avoid. I didn't like seeing Ethan reduced to paper, but I understood why it mattered. People who arrive late to love always try to rewrite the last chapter as if it erases the whole book. The requests were meant to pressure me into mistakes, into oversharing, into reacting. Instead, my lawyer responded the same way each time: firm, narrow, controlled. Carla and Lika expected a grieving old woman they could confuse. What they got was a wall with a clipboard. I could feel their frustration even without seeing them. It came through the tone of Carla's voicemails, the way her baby turned into, "You're being unreasonable." It came through Lika's texts that started with sweetness and ended with insults disguised as concern. "Inez, we can do this quietly," she'd write. "For the child." The child. Always the child. She used that word like it was a hammer she could tap on my door until it opened. I didn't respond. Silence is a language too, and I was learning how to speak it fluently. I heard about their reaction from the only place reactions can't hide, their own impatience. Carla showed up at my gate one afternoon and stood there like she was daring me to come outside. I stayed behind the curtain and watched her talk to Lika on speakerphone, her voice cutting through the air like a blade. "This old woman thinks she's smarter than us," Carla snapped. "She's stalling." Lika's voice came back faint through the phone, tight and fast. "Because she is smarter," she hissed. "You're the one who's making this look messy." Carla scoffed. "Messy? I'm his mother. That matters." Lika let out a small laugh that didn't sound amused. "Your mother act would matter more if you'd been there when he was alive." The sentence hung between them like a slap. Carla's head snapped to the side as if she'd been hit anyway. "Watch your mouth," she warned. "I brought you into this." "No," Lika shot back, and I could hear her smile through the words. "I brought you into this because you needed a title. I'm the wife. I'm the one carrying leverage." Carla's voice rose. "Stop rubbing that belly like it's a badge. You're overplaying it." Lika's reply came sharper, colder. "And you're dead weight. All you do is talk too loud and make us look greedy." I pressed my fingertips to the curtain, heart steady, stomach tight. Not because their fighting surprised me, but because it confirmed what Ethan had predicted without ever saying it out loud. Their alliance wasn't built on loyalty. It was built on appetite. And appetite turns on itself when it isn't fed fast enough. The next packet of papers came 2 days later, thicker, more aggressive, filled with bigger accusations, bigger demands. My lawyer read through it on the phone, voice calm. "They're escalating," he said, "trying to force leverage." "Let them," I replied, and my own voice surprised me with how steady it sounded. After I hung up, I sat at the dining table where Ethan had signed those papers with his trembling hand, and I felt grief rise again. But this time, it wasn't soft. It was sharp, purposeful. I didn't have the luxury of breaking down. Ethan had trusted me with something that could destroy people if handled wrong, and I could feel that responsibility pressing on my ribs like a second heartbeat. That night, I opened the drawer where I'd placed the sealed envelope Ethan had given me. It was still there, untouched, edges crisp, my name written in his careful handwriting like he'd wanted to make sure it landed in the right hands. I held it for a long moment, weighing it like it had its own gravity. Then I set it on the table and called my lawyer back with one simple instruction. "There's a step we need to take," I said quietly. "Not an accusation, just a verification." My lawyer didn't ask why. He simply said, "Understood." When I ended the call, the house was silent again, but it didn't feel empty. It felt watchful. I turned the envelope over once in my hands, staring at the seal like it might speak, and I realized my grief had shifted into something else entirely, something colder, clearer. I placed the envelope in front of me and stared at it until the lamplight blurred around the edges, because I knew the next move would change everything. I didn't open Ethan's sealed letter when the grief was raw, or when Carla first knocked like she owned the porch, or when Lika started rubbing, her belly like it was a key to every locked door in this house. I held it through all of that. I held it because Ethan had been clear, and because once you break a seal like that, you can't pretend you're still living in the old version of your life. But when Lika stood on my porch and said, "My child is his heir," she didn't just make a claim. She reached into Ethan's grave and tried to pull leverage out of it. That was when his words became an instruction instead of a warning. That night, I sat alone at the dining table with the envelope in front of me, lamplight pooling over the paper like a spotlight. My hands didn't shake, my stomach did. I stared at Ethan's handwriting, steady, careful, familiar, and for a moment I hated every person who had turned his last weeks into a hunt. Then I slid my fingernail under the seal and broke it with one clean motion. The sound was small, but it felt loud in my chest. Inside was a single page, folded twice, and a smaller slip of paper tucked behind it. Ethan hadn't written a speech. He hadn't written a goodbye. He'd written what he always wrote when he cared about an outcome, a clean list. The first line hit me like cold water. If Lika uses a baby to come for control, do not argue, do not accuse, do not plead, request verification. Below that, he'd written dates, short, specific notes from the last weeks of his life, the kind you don't notice until you're looking for patterns. A day she told him she'd had an appointment, then came home with no paperwork and a story that changed by the hour. A day she claimed she was far enough along to need certain accommodations, then forgot the number when he asked her quietly. A day he heard her on the phone describing his decline in a tone that felt rehearsed. The words were simple, the implications weren't. My throat tightened, and the room swayed for a second. Not because I was shocked she'd been calculating, but because Ethan had been lying, in pain and still paying attention to the shape of her lies. At the bottom of the page, he'd written one sentence, plain and hard. "I don't know if the child is real, but I know the claim will be used. Follow procedure." The smaller slip of paper was even shorter. It listed exactly what to request if the baby became part of a legal argument. Basic confirmation tied to any unborn heir claim. Nothing scandalous, nothing invasive, just the kind of step that separates truth from performance when money is on the line. I sat there with the letter pressed flat under my palm, breathing through the sickness rising in my throat. My eyes burned, but I didn't cry. Crying would give me release. Release wasn't what I needed. Ethan hadn't asked me to feel less. He'd asked me to act clean. I picked up my phone and called my lawyer. When he answered, I didn't explain the whole story. I didn't need to. "They're using a baby," I said. "We request standard confirmation tied to the claim, nothing else." He was quiet for a moment, then his voice stayed calm, professional. "Understood," he said. "We can do that." The next day, the request went out, written in plain language, firm but restrained. No accusations, no dramatic tone, just a simple line asking for confirmation appropriate to an unborn heir position being asserted in a contested estate process. I imagined Lika reading it, belly in one hand, phone in the other, face tightening as she realized this wasn't a courtroom fight. It was a test. The first response didn't come from documents, it came from words. Lika called my lawyer's office and left a message that sounded wounded. "This is cruel," she said, voice trembling on purpose. "I'm grieving, I'm pregnant. Why are you doing this to me?" Carla followed up with her own call, louder, angrier, trying to bulldoze the whole request with indignation. "You're harassing her," she snapped. "You're trying to stress my grandbaby." But indignation isn't proof. Days passed. Excuses arrived like clockwork. Lika's lawyer sent a short note saying she was in the process of obtaining records and that the request was unnecessary and emotionally harmful. Then another note saying she'd been out of town for family support. Then a message saying the clinic had delays. Every answer was a story, not a document. Every delay felt like a hand hovering over a chessboard, refusing to move because the next square was dangerous. I stopped feeling sick and started feeling clear. Ethan had been right. A real claim doesn't fear simple procedure. A false claim fears the smallest light. My lawyer called me late one afternoon. "They've sent something," he said. His tone was careful, not triumphant. "A note." "From where?" I asked. "A doctor," he replied, and I heard paper shifting on his end like he was reading. "But it's odd." I held the phone tighter. "Odd how?" There was a pause, and when he spoke again, his voice dropped lower, the way professionals sound when they're trying not to alarm you before they're sure. "The formatting doesn't match what we usually see," he said, "and the details are thin." I stared at Ethan's letter still spread on my table like a map, and for the first time since the funeral, I felt something colder than grief settle into my bones. "Send it to me," I said quietly. When it arrived by email, I opened it slowly, and the first thing I saw wasn't a name or a date. It was the letterhead, slightly blurry, slightly crooked, like it had been copied too many times. The note looked official at first glance. Clean letters, a signature line, a few medical words placed like stamps of authority, but the longer I stared at it, the more it felt like a stranger wearing someone else's coat. The letterhead was there, yes, but slightly blurred, as if it had been scanned and rescanned, until the edges lost their sharpness. The address line didn't sit straight. The spacing between paragraphs was uneven, like the person who typed it was guessing. And the date at the top, simple, ordinary, didn't match the story Lika had been telling about her appointments at all. I didn't need to be a doctor to notice when paper tries too hard to look like truth. I forwarded it to my lawyer without commentary. I didn't write, "She's lying." I didn't write, "This is fake." I sent it the same way you hand a quiet man a bullet you didn't fire and let him decide what to do with it. He called me the next morning. "We're not treating this like a scandal," he said, voice calm. "We're treating it like an incomplete submission." I appreciated that. Scandals make noise. Noise gives people a stage. "What happens now?" I asked. "We request the proper records," he replied, "the same way we would in any case where an unborn heir is being asserted." He didn't sound excited, he sounded patient, and patience is dangerous to people who rely on pressure. The request went out that day, formal, direct, no drama. It asked for the supporting documentation that normally sits behind a note like that, confirmation that the provider existed, that the appointment occurred, that the timeline aligned. It also asked, politely, for clarification on dates, because dates are where stories go to die. Lika didn't respond with records. She responded with emotion. My lawyer played me her voicemail, and even through the phone, I could hear how carefully she was trying to sound fragile. "This is harassment," she said, breathy and trembling. "I'm grieving my husband. Why are you doing this to me?" In the background, there was no clinic noise, no muffled office voices, just quiet like she was sitting somewhere safe trying to perform pain. Then Carla left her own voicemail, loud enough to feel like a shove. "You're stressing. Her out on purpose," she barked. "If anything happens to that baby, it's on you." The message was meant to scare me into backing off. It didn't. It only confirmed what I already knew. A real claim doesn't panic at paperwork. A false claim panics at the smallest request. 2 days later, I saw Carla and Lika together for the first time since the porch confrontation. They were standing beside Carla's car at the curb across the street from my house, not even trying to hide. Carla's arms were crossed, posture stiff. Lika stood close, belly forward like a shield, head tilted in that wounded way she'd learned to use. I couldn't hear everything through the window, but I heard enough. "You told me you had this," Carla snapped. "You told me you already went to the doctor." Lika's hands lifted, palms out, like she was trying to calm a wild animal. "I did," she hissed. "I told you I did." Carla's head jerked back. "Then where are the records?" She demanded. "Why is your lawyer stalling?" Lika's face tightened. "Because they're making it hard," she said quickly. "They're twisting everything. You're the one who keeps talking. You keep giving them reasons to look." Carla leaned in, voice cutting. "Don't blame me. I'm not the one rubbing my belly like it's a passcode." Lika's eyes flashed. And I'm not the one who abandoned him, she shot back. The words landed like a slap. Carla's mouth fell open for half a second, then snapped shut. Watch yourself, Carla warned. I can walk away from this and leave you alone with those papers. Lika took a breath, forcing her face back into softness as if she remembered she had to keep looking like the victim. You won't, she said quietly. You need this, and I need you. They were united only because they were hungry. That's what made their alliance brittle. When they went back inside Carla's car, I stepped away from the window and sat down at my table, hands folded, heart steady. I wasn't enjoying this. I wasn't triumphant. I was watching two people try to build a story on sand. The first deposition happened in a small office that smelled like printer ink and stale coffee. I sat at the end of the table while my lawyer asked questions in a voice so calm it sounded polite, but every word was a needle. Lika arrived with her lawyer, dressed carefully, hair smooth, face pale on purpose. She kept one hand on her belly the whole time, as if she was afraid it would disappear if she stopped touching it. When my lawyer asked her about timelines, her answers came too fast, too rehearsed. "How far along are you?" he asked gently. "A little over 3 months," she said. "And when did you find out?" he continued. Lika blinked once. "Right before Ethan got really bad," she replied, voice softening. My lawyer didn't raise his voice. "Define really bad," he said. Lika's eyes flicked to her. "Attorney." "Hospice," she said after a beat. The room went quiet. My lawyer looked down at his notes, then back up. "So you learned you were pregnant right before hospice," he said evenly, "and you're a little over 3 months now." Lika's mouth tightened. Carla, seated behind her, shifted in her chair. The numbers didn't line up. Not cleanly. Not the way truth lines up when it's simple. Lika tried to smile. "Stress affects memory," she murmured. My lawyer nodded once, as if he agreed, and then he slid a document across the table without flourish. "Then we'll let the records clarify," he said. Lika's face changed, not dramatically, not with a scream, just a subtle tightening around the eyes, like she'd realized the room was no longer a stage she controlled. A week later, the court issued a short order, limited, specific, procedural, requiring verification appropriate to the unborn heir claim being asserted. When my lawyer read it to me over the phone, I didn't celebrate. I simply listened, because I could already picture Lika's face when she saw it, that brief, unguarded moment when performance meets a wall. It wasn't a shouting match that broke them first. It was money. Not Ethan's money, mine stayed locked behind procedure and patience, but their own money draining out in slow, humiliating payments that didn't buy them control. The first time I heard their lawyer's tone change, I knew the pressure had reached bone. My lawyer put the call on speaker so I could listen, not because I needed to speak, but because sometimes it's useful to hear the shape of desperation when it still thinks it's professional. The man who had smiled so easily on my porch didn't sound smooth anymore. He sounded clipped, impatient, like he was tired of performing confidence for clients who weren't winning. "We need to discuss resolution," he said. "This is becoming expensive." Carla's voice cut in immediately, louder than it needed to be. "We can't just let her keep everything," she snapped. "She's an old woman. She's stalling until we give up." On the other line, Lika didn't sound fragile today. She sounded sharp. "We're not giving up," she said. "We can't. That house alone." She caught herself mid-sentence, like she remembered the call might be recorded somewhere, like she remembered that saying too much out loud could become evidence. The lawyer cleared his throat. "I'm saying this plainly," he replied. "The court's order requires verification. Without supporting records, the unborn heir claim is weakened." Weakened. He didn't say false. He didn't accuse his own client. He chose the cleanest word he could find that still carried the warning. "This story isn't holding." Carla scoffed. "It's real," she insisted. "She's pregnant." Lika went quiet for half a second too long, the kind of pause that tells on you even when your mouth doesn't. Then she said, "They're making it impossible. They're asking for things they don't have a right to ask." My lawyer spoke for the first time, calm and even, like he was reciting a weather report. "They have a right to request verification because you invoke the unborn heir as basis for your claim," he said. Silence followed. Not mine. Theirs. That's when I realized they were finally understanding what Ethan had built. My silence wasn't weakness. It was a trap. They couldn't pull me into emotional mistakes, so all they had left was their own paperwork and their own mouths, and those were starting to betray them. In the weeks that followed, their posture changed. Carla stopped showing up at my house because she knew I wouldn't open the door. Lika stopped sending sweet texts because sweetness wasn't getting results. They tried a different approach, settlement talk. Carla's lawyer floated it first, softening his tone like a man trying to sell peace. "Perhaps we can discuss a reasonable distribution," he said, "to avoid continued litigation." Carla didn't even pretend to be humble. "Just give me what's fair," she said. "I'm his mother." But when the word fair entered the conversation, Lika's voice tightened. "No," she said. "We're not settling for scraps." Carla's irritation flared. "Scraps!" she snapped. "You wouldn't have anything without me backing you up." Lika laughed, short and sharp. "Backing me up," she echoed. "All you did was show up late and talk loud. I'm the wife. I'm the one with the leverage." Carla's voice rose. "Your leverage is collapsing," she hissed. "They don't believe you." Lika's reply came low and dangerous. "If I go down," she said slowly, "you go down." The room on my end stayed quiet, but I felt the sentence in my stomach like a stone dropping. That wasn't grief talking. That was extortion. Carla sputtered, then snapped, "What are you threatening me for?" Lika didn't answer right away. Then she said, "Don't act innocent. You were the one whispering, 'We'll handle it after.' You were the one pushing me to make it stronger. If you think you can walk away now and leave me holding the bag, you're wrong." The lawyer cut in, voice colder now, less patient. "Enough," he said. "We have a credibility issue. The records submitted are insufficient. The timelines have inconsistencies, and the court is not going to tolerate delay indefinitely." Carla tried to interrupt, but the lawyer didn't let her. "If you cannot substantiate the unborn heir claim," he continued, "the court will weigh that against you. It impacts your position across the entire filing." Across the entire filing. That was the quiet threat. If the baby story collapses, everything else starts to look like a reach. I sat at my table with my hands folded, not speaking, not reacting, letting their fear fill the space where my emotion used to live. A week later, my lawyer came to my house and sat across from me with a thin stack of papers. "They've missed a deadline," he said. "They requested extensions. The court granted limited time. They still didn't produce what was required." He didn't smile. He didn't gloat. He just looked at me the way people look at someone who's carrying something heavy and doing it well. "This puts them in a weak position," he added. "It's not over, but it changes the tone." I nodded slowly. I didn't feel victory. I felt direction. Defense had kept me standing. Closure would end this. "What's next?" I asked. My lawyer's phone buzzed in his pocket before he could answer. He glanced at the screen and his expression shifted. "They've filed something," he said, "an emergency motion." The words landed like a sudden siren in a quiet street. "On what grounds?" I asked. He exhaled once, short. "It's messy," he said, "and it has Carla's fingerprints all over it." Carla's emergency motion didn't arrive like a careful legal argument. It arrived like a tantrum dressed in formal paper. My lawyer came to my house early that morning, coat still on, folder tucked under his arm, face set in that calm expression professionals wear when they're walking into a room full of other people's chaos. "She's claiming you hid assets," he told me as we sat at my dining table. "She's also alleging you stole his mind." The phrase made my stomach twist, not because it was clever, but because it was ugly. It was what people say when they want to strip a dying man of agency and turn his choices into someone else's crime. Carla couldn't stand that Ethan had decided who deserved him, so she was trying to rewrite the decision as manipulation. The hearing happened fast. That's the point of an emergency motion. Create urgency, force reaction, make the other side stumble. Carla expected me to show up looking frail, confused, desperate. I didn't. I showed up quiet, hair combed, clothes simple, hands folded in my lap like I was attending church, not a battle. Lika arrived in a fitted dress that emphasized her belly, one hand resting on it like a shield, the other gripping her lawyer's arm as if she needed support to stand. Carla walked in beside her with her chin high, eyes darting around the room like she was measuring whether the judge would be sympathetic to a mother's anger. When the judge entered, the air tightened. Not because the judge looked frightening, but because authority always exposes performance. Carla stood the moment she was allowed and started speaking too quickly, words rushing out as if speed could replace proof. "Your Honor," she said, voice trembling on purpose, "my son was dying. He was vulnerable. He was under her control. She isolated him. She hid things. She stole his mind." The judge didn't react to the emotion. The judge looked down at the papers. "Mrs. Morris," the judge said calmly, "these are serious allegations. What evidence do you have of incapacity or coercion?" Carla blinked. For a second, she looked surprised the tears weren't enough. "He was on hospice," she said, like hospice itself was a crime scene. "He was in pain. He wasn't thinking clearly." The judge's eyes lifted. "Hospice does not automatically mean incapacity," the judge replied. "Do you have medical documentation stating he lacked capacity at the time the documents were executed?" Carla's mouth tightened. Her lawyer jumped in quickly, voice smooth, trying to patch the holes Carla had ripped open. "We believe undue influence occurred," he said. "The beneficiary is a grandmother, not a spouse. It raises concern." My lawyer didn't argue with emotion. He responded with paper. "Your Honor," he said, "we have independent counsel involvement, contemporaneous notes, and third-party confirmation of capacity at the time of execution." He didn't make it dramatic. He simply laid the foundation like brick. The judge flipped through pages, eyes scanning, and the questions that followed didn't turn toward me. They turned toward Carla and Lika. "Why did you wait until 3 days after the funeral to initiate contact?" the judge asked. Carla stiffened. "We were grieving," she replied. The judge's tone stayed even. "You were grieving, yet you arrived with counsel and prepared pleadings within 72 hours. Carla's cheeks flushed. Lika's fingers tightened on her belly. The judge looked at Lika next. "Mrs. Morris," the judge said, "you asserted an unborn heir claim. Have you produced the verification ordered by this court?" Lika's mouth opened, then closed. Her lawyer spoke for her. "We have submitted a note," he said. The judge's eyebrows rose slightly. "A note is not verification," the judge replied. "You were granted limited time and you have provided inconsistent submissions." Lika's face stayed composed, but I saw her eyes flick, just once, toward Carla, like she wanted to blame her, without speaking. The judge leaned back slightly, the way people do when they've heard enough to know where the truth isn't. "What I'm seeing," the judge said, voice firm now, "is a claim built on suspicion, rather than evidence. Independent counsel was present. Capacity safeguards were taken. Your filings allege coercion, yet you have not produced a coherent account of how coercion occurred." Carla's lawyer tried to recover, but the judge's focus didn't soften. "If you continue to file emergency motions without basis," the judge added, "this court will consider sanctions." The word sanctions landed like a slap. Carla's face tightened. Lika's lips pressed into a thin line. When the hearing ended, They didn't look victorious. They looked exposed. Outside the courtroom in the hallway, Carla hissed at Lika under her breath. "You told me you had this," she snapped. "You told me the baby would make them back off." Lika's voice came back low and sharp. "And you told me you had proof of manipulation," she shot back. "All you did was embarrass us in there." Their lawyer stepped between them, jaw clenched. "Stop talking," he warned, voice tight. "Every word you say is a liability." Carla rolled her eyes. Lika scoffed softly, still rubbing her belly like muscle memory, but the gesture looked less confident now. My lawyer guided me to a quiet corner and spoke without raising his voice. "The judge is skeptical," he said. "That's good." I didn't smile. I just nodded. "We're moving toward closure," he continued. "Now we prepare to show the court what matters most, timing." He didn't say more in the hallway. He didn't need to. Timing was the blade Ethan had placed in my hand months ago. Later that afternoon, back at my house, my lawyer opened his folder and slid one clean document across my table. "This is the property transfer record," he said. "Recorded months before Ethan's. Decline." I watched the ink date like it was a door locking. The moment I looked up, Lika's voice hit my phone through a voicemail notification. Her tone no longer soft, no longer fragile. It was sharp, shaking with fury. "You tricked me," she hissed. "That house was supposed to be ours." After the hearing, Lika didn't come back to my porch. Not in person, not anymore. People like her don't like face-to-face once the ground starts shifting under their story. She came through paper and pressure instead. Letters from her lawyer that grew nastier by the week, emails that accused without evidence, and whispers that tried to crawl through the community like smoke. I started hearing it from strangers who had no business knowing anything about Ethan's private life. A neighbor asked me softly at the mailbox if I was doing okay with all that fighting. A woman from church squeezed my arm and said, "I'm praying for you, because people say you took advantage." That's when I understood Lika's new plan. If she couldn't win in court, she would try to win in reputation. She wanted to turn me into the villain so the world would pressure me into settling. I didn't correct anyone. I didn't defend myself to people who were only repeating what they'd heard. Silence isn't just restraint. Silence is refusal. My lawyer called me one afternoon and said, "They've escalated their language again." His voice didn't sound alarmed. It sounded almost bored, like he'd seen this movie before. "It's bluffing," he added. "They're trying to rattle you into giving something up." "They can keep talking," I said. "Talking doesn't change dates." That was the truth. Dates don't bend for emotion. They don't bend for pregnancy claims. They don't bend for a mother's regret performed in public. When we produced the property transfer record, it wasn't dramatic. It wasn't a courtroom slam. It was one clean sheet of paper with a recorded date stamped in plain ink, sitting in a file like it had been waiting for them to come embarrass themselves. The record showed Ethan transferred the house months before hospice, months before the frantic last weeks, months before anyone could argue undue influence with a straight face. I watched my lawyer slide it across the table in a conference room, watched Lika's attorney glance down at it, and watched the small shift in posture that happens when confidence drains out of a person's shoulders. Lika didn't cry. She didn't faint. She tightened, her jaw locked. Her eyes sharpened, and her hand moved instinctively to her belly as if it could protect her from ink. Carla's face flushed with something ugly, anger mixed with humiliation. "That can't be right," Carla snapped. "He lived there. He was paying things. He didn't—" She stopped because she realized every word she spoke could be turned into a question. Lika leaned toward her, attorney, and whispered something that made him sigh, long and slow, like a man fighting the urge to roll his eyes in front of a client. "Mrs. Morris," her lawyer said carefully, choosing each word like he was trying to keep them from running into traffic. "The transfer date is outside the death window. It's clean." Lika's nostrils flared. "So what are you saying?" she asked, voice thin. "I'm saying," he replied, "the house is not available to contest on the theory you're pursuing." The sentence landed like a door closing. Lika's widow leverage, the sympathy posture, the belly rub, the mournful voice, evaporated right there in the room. Without the house, she wasn't a tragic young widow fighting for a baby. She was just a claimant with a collapsing story and rising legal bills. Carla turned on her immediately, the way weak alliances always do when the prize disappears. "You told me you had this," Carla hissed, leaning in, eyes flashing. "You told me the baby would make them fold." Lika's head snapped toward her. "And you told me you had proof she manipulated him," she shot back. "All you have is tears and noise." Carla's mouth tightened. "Watch your mouth," she warned. Lika's voice dropped, cold and precise. "If we lose, it'll be because you couldn't stop performing." Their lawyer cut in sharply, his patience finally fraying. "Enough," he said. "You are both making this worse. Continuing this posture invites sanctions and deeper scrutiny." Deeper scrutiny meant the court looking harder at everything. At the timeline, the filings, the doctor note, the way they'd rushed the funeral week with prepared accusations. Carla scoffed, but her eyes flickered. Fear, not of losing, of being exposed. My lawyer didn't raise his voice. He didn't gloat. He didn't even smile. "We are not here to embarrass anyone," he said. "We are here to end a baseless contest." I watched. Carla's hands clench, watched Lika's lips part as if she wanted to scream, and remembered she needed to look controlled. I kept my face calm, but inside, I felt something shift, my grief settling deeper, quieter, as if it finally trusted me to carry it while I finished what Ethan had started. The next deposition session was smaller, tighter, and the questions were sharper because the court had lost patience with stories. Carla arrived dressed like a woman ready to be seen as righteous. She sat upright, chin lifted, eyes watery on purpose. When she spoke about Ethan, she used the same phrases over and over. "We reconnected. I was there. I supported him." She said it like repetition could become evidence. My lawyer listened without interrupting, then asked one simple question in a voice so gentle it sounded almost kind. "Mrs. Morris," he said, "you've testified that you reconnected with Ethan before his illness progressed. Can you tell us the date of your first visit to his home after that reconnection?" Carla blinked. "It was early," she said quickly, "before everything got bad." My lawyer nodded slowly and slid a printed page across the table. No flourish, no drama. "Do you recognize this?" he asked. Carla leaned forward, eyes narrowing. Her face changed as she read the top line, because it wasn't a story. It was a record, and the record didn't match her reconnection at all. The courtroom felt smaller than the first time, not because the room had changed, but because the lies had. They didn't have as much space to move anymore. Carla sat at the plaintiff's table with her shoulders stiff and her hands folded too tightly, as if she was holding herself together by force. Lika sat beside her, belly forward, face composed the way women compose themselves when they think composure is proof. But the air in the room wasn't theirs to control today. The judge came in, took one look at the file, and the tone shifted before anyone even spoke. This wasn't a day for performances. This was a day for endings. The judge didn't waste time on niceties. "I have reviewed the submissions," the judge said, eyes moving from Carla to Lika to their attorney. "And I have reviewed the record of capacity safeguards, independent counsel involvement, and the inconsistencies in your claims." Carla lifted her chin as if she still believed motherhood could override. "Evidence." "Your Honor," she began. The judge raised a hand. "No," the judge said, calm but firm. "You will listen." Carla's mouth closed slowly, and I watched the first crack in her confidence spread across her face like a hairline fracture in glass. The judge spoke in plain language, not harsh, just direct. The court acknowledged Ethan's right to make decisions, the documented steps taken to confirm clarity, and the presence of neutral professionals. The judge referenced the repeated failures to substantiate the unborn heir claim in the way the court required. The judge didn't accuse them of forging anything. That wasn't the judge's job today. But the judge made it clear the court could not entertain a theory built on suspicion while ignoring procedure. Lika's lawyer tried to pivot, his voice smooth but strained. "Then perhaps we address spousal rights," he said quickly, like he was grabbing for a new rope mid-fall. "Mrs. Morris is the surviving spouse. She is entitled to—" The judge's gaze didn't soften. "Entitled to what is in the probate estate," the judge corrected. "And this court has seen documentation indicating significant assets are not part of probate." Carla's head snapped toward her lawyer. Lika's eyes widened slightly. That's when I understood they had been fighting a battle they didn't even fully understand, swinging at shadows, hoping the noise would shake something loose. Their lawyer swallowed, then continued, trying again. "We believe there are assets that were concealed," he said. "We believe the grandmother—" The judge cut him off with a question so simple, it felt like a blade. "Belief is not evidence," the judge said. "You have alleged undue influence without substantiation. You have asserted an unborn heir claim without meeting verification requirements. You have filed emergency motions without basis. At this point, the court is not entertaining this further." Carla's hands clenched so hard her knuckles paled. Lika's composure slipped for the first time in front of everyone. It wasn't a full breakdown. It was smaller than that. Her lips trembled, her jaw tightened, and her eyes darted around the room like she was looking for a door that wasn't there. The judge continued, voice steady and final. "The petition is dismissed," the judge said. "This contest is thrown out." The words landed heavy in the silence, and for a moment even Carla didn't know what to do with her own anger. Then the judge added the part that turned their defeat into a consequence. "Given the pattern of filings and the lack of credible support, the court will consider costs and fees." Costs, fees. That was the new problem they couldn't perform their way out of. Carla's face changed, fear sliding in where arrogance used to sit. Lika's hand tightened on her belly, but the gesture didn't look comforting anymore. It looked desperate. I sat, still, hands folded, eyes forward, feeling the strangest thing. Not victory, but a fresh wave of grief rising up like a tide that didn't care about court outcomes. Ethan should have been sitting beside me. Ethan should have been alive enough to laugh at how hard they tried to steal from a man who'd already planned for their theft. Instead, I was here listening to a judge end a fight that never should have existed, and all I could think was how unfair it was that the living had more stamina for greed than they had for love. When the hearing ended, people filed out quietly. Carla walked fast, head down, lawyer murmuring in her ear. Lika lingered for half a second, eyes fixed on me like she wanted to throw something, but knew the courtroom cameras, real or imagined, would catch it. Outside, the air was cold and bright, the kind of day that feels wrong for heavy things. My lawyer spoke softly beside me, explaining next steps about dismissal paperwork and fee motions, but his words floated past me like distant traffic. I watched Carla and Lika stand near the steps, their lawyer talking in a tense whisper, his hands moving like he was trying to keep them from making it worse. Carla looked at Lika with pure blame. Lika's face was tight, eyes glossy but not with tears, more like rage trapped behind a mask. As I walked past them, Lika stepped forward suddenly, close enough that I could smell her perfume, sweet and sharp at the same time. Her voice came out low, bitter, stripped of every performance she'd tried to wear. "He died and still chose you over me," she spat. "All that money, all that planning, and he couldn't even leave me something worth staying for." The house was quiet in a way that didn't feel peaceful. It felt like a room holding its breath long after the person who mattered has left it. I sat at Ethan's dining table with a cup of tea I didn't taste, staring at the same window he used to stare through when he was thinking. And, for the first time since the judge dismissed their case, there was no noise left to distract me from the truth. Nothing about this was a win. A court can end a lawsuit, but it can't undo a diagnosis. It can't unmake a funeral. It can't put a young man back in his own home. The silence that followed the fight didn't feel like victory music. It felt like the sound of an empty seat. I kept expecting to hear Ethan's footsteps, soft, measured, polite, coming down the hallway with that half smile he wore when he'd solved something in his head. Instead, all I heard was the refrigerator hum and my own breath moving in and out, like proof that time had decided to keep going without asking permission. The money stayed where Ethan placed it, and I handled it the way he asked. Quietly, cleanly, without making it a spectacle for anyone who didn't deserve to know it existed. I met with the same neutral professionals Ethan trusted, and I moved through the steps with a calm I didn't always feel inside. We funded pancreatic cancer research the way Ethan had done in life, without applause, without headlines, without his name etched on a wall just to make other people feel inspired. I signed the paperwork with a pen that felt heavy, not because it was complicated, but because every stroke reminded me why we were doing it. I set up a support fund for young families too, exactly the kind Ethan would have wanted if he'd been given the chance to hold his own child. It wasn't charity as a performance, it was care as a continuation. I made sure the help went to people who needed it without having to beg, without being humiliated first. The first check I approved made my chest ache so sharply I had to pause and press my palm flat against the table. Ethan should have been here to see the good his fear had still managed to create. Instead, I was the one carrying his intention, like a lantern through a house that suddenly felt too big. One morning, before the sun was fully up, I walked into his home office and closed the door behind me. I hadn't gone in there since the funeral. The room still smelled faintly like him. Clean soap, paper, that soft metallic scent computers give off when they've been warm for hours. His desk chair sat slightly turned, as if he'd only stepped away for a moment. A small stack of notebooks rested where he'd left them, and for a second I couldn't breathe, because grief has a way of hiding until you step into the exact place it lives. I moved slowly, like the room might break if I moved too fast. I sat in his chair and looked at the blank monitor, remembering how he used to explain things to me in plain language, patient as a teacher, never making me feel small. I let myself cry once, quiet and private, the way I'd been holding it back for months, not sobbing, not collapsing, just tears sliding down my face because the body needs a release somewhere when the world refuses to stop being cruel. Then I wiped my cheeks, opened the top drawer, and found what I'd been looking for, a folder Ethan had labeled in his handwriting, the kind of careful handwriting he used when he wanted no confusion. Inside was nothing dramatic, just a list. Names of charities, categories of support, a few lines of instruction about discretion. Ethan didn't write revenge into his plans. He wrote protection. He wrote legacy. He wrote, in his quiet way, a refusal to let greed turn his death into a feeding frenzy. A week later, the final notice arrived through my lawyer's office, delivered the way consequences should be delivered, formally, without shouting. My lawyer read it to me over the phone, voice calm. Carla and Lika's contest had been dismissed with prejudice. Their motions were denied. The court had granted fees in part. Their lawyer had withdrawn. Carla had stopped returning calls. Lika had stopped sending messages. The silence they finally offered wasn't dignity. It was collapse. "They're done," my lawyer said simply. I stared at the wall while he spoke, watching a patch of sunlight move slowly across the paint, like the day didn't know anything about human pain. "Good," I replied. But the word didn't come out satisfied. It came out tired. After the call, I sat at the table again, the same spot where Ethan had once leaned in and placed a sealed envelope into my palm. I thought about Carla's last hard stare in court. I thought about Lika's bitter whisper outside the courthouse steps, the way she revealed herself in one sentence. And then I thought about Ethan, 34 years old, skin turning yellow, still clear enough to see who was circling him like wolves. He didn't outsmart them because he hated them. He outsmarted them because he refused to be used. There's a difference. Revenge needs an audience. Protection needs discipline. Ethan's plan wasn't about punishing them with spectacle. It was about ensuring they couldn't punish me with chaos after he was gone. The secret wasn't mine to brag about. It wasn't mine to confess in a moment of loneliness. It was mine to hold the way he asked, quietly, like a sacred thing. So I kept living in the house without treating it like a trophy. I kept funding the work he cared about without turning it into a headline. I spoke his name in private, in prayer, in memory, not in public statements meant to hurt people who were already empty inside. And when I passed his office door, I didn't flinch anymore. I just paused sometimes, hand on the frame, and whispered, "I did it the way you wanted." Because in the end, the only person I owed a report to was the boy I raised, the man I loved, the one who trusted me when he didn't trust anyone else. Some secrets aren't lies. They're shields.